genocide, and they are, of course, condemning it as well. Iran also called out the United States for supporting Israel.
United States and several European countries are watching and supporting the killing of about 7,000 civilians in less than 3 weeks by the Israeli regime in Gaza and West Bank of Palestine. And they help this regime militarily and financially. We recommend the United States to work for peace and security, not war against people, children, and women.
Now, for more on this, our correspondent Susan Teherani has brought us all the updates surrounding the discussions about the crisis in West Asia. Let's listen in.
During Thursday's session of the United Nations General Assembly, the draft resolution called for a ceasefire, among other things. It was proposed by Jordan and supported by the Arab world, so not surprisingly, it put the onus on Israel. Israel's ambassador to the United Nations outraged that the draft resolution does not mention or condemn Hamas, said, quote unquote, that Israel is not at war with human beings. We are at war with monster. It's not Auschwitz, it's Hamas. Meanwhile, Iran's foreign minister, addressing the same session, warned the United States that Washington will not be spared if it continues to support the quote-unquote genocide of Palestinians. The war of words continue between Iran and the United States, as recently U.S. President Joe Biden also called on Iran to not take advantage of the war between Israel and Hamas. Susan Teherani reporting from New York for WION World is One.
All right, to discuss matters further, Colonel David B. DeRoche joins us live from Washington, D.C. He is a strategic studies professor at the National Defense University. Always a pleasure to have you here on World DNA, sir.
Thank you.
Sir, thank you so much for joining us. Now, Iran's foreign minister lashed out at the United States. It's warned that the United States will not be spared in this fire. What I'm trying to understand is the practical implications of a statement of such magnitude. How do you assess this?
Well, I think what he's trying to do is restrain U.S. support for Israel. And I think he's trying to basically take the attention of the world away from what's going on in Gaza and trying to raise the threat of a wider issue of war to force people in the United States and people in countries friendly to the United States like India to try to pressure the United States to restrain Israel and restrain American action against various Iranian proxies in the region.
Colonel, now, Egypt and Jordan, the immediate neighboring nations around Gaza, now they've both refused from taking any kind of Palestinian refugees into their land. So when Iran says it is ready to play its part in the humanitarian endeavor and Qatar and Turkey stand along with it, talk to us more about what role these nations will play, especially when the neighboring nations have already refused.
Right. So Iran will play no meaningful role. There are a number of Afghan refugees who have moved to Iran. They're basically incarcerated. And usually what Iran does is say, look, if you fight for us in Syria, then for a year or so, then you can wander around Iran freely. Jordan has a large number of Palestinian refugees from earlier Israeli wars. And, the tribal elite that rules Jordan view them as a destabilizing factor. Recall the Black September operations that led to a big, violence and near overthrow of the Hashemite regime in Jordan. So they're not eager to take in more. Egypt views Hamas as a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which they regard as an enemy. So they don't want to take in more refugees either. Lebanon already is inundated with refugees from Syria. About 25% of the population of Lebanon right now are Sunni Muslim refugees from Syria. And taking in more Sunni Muslims will upset the demographic balance in a way that will diminish the power of Iran's most powerful proxy, which is Lebanese Hezbollah. So I don't think that any country will take a significant number of Gazan refugees, and I don't think that Hamas wants them to leave because there's a strong possibility Israel won't allow them back if they do.
So now that being said, there have been nearly 16 attacks on U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria in the past week from Iran-backed militias in the region. What's Iran's game plan here? What is your assessment of that?
Well, there's a couple of things. So Iran views itself as the leader of the axis of resistance against Israel and the United States, which they say are the threats to peace and security in the Middle East. There's a problem with this. The axis of resistance is Iranian leadership, and then you have Lebanese Hezbollah, you have various Syrian militias, you have various Iraqi militias, you have Hamas, and you have the Houthis in Yemen. They make up the axis of resistance. These are all Arabs. They're all under the command of Persians. So that's your first problem. Mm-hmm. The second problem is if one branch of the axis of resistance is involved in battle and the other ones are not, then that makes it look really bad. And Hamas is the only Sunni part of the axis of resistance. The other are all Shia. So we have a situation here where the Sunni Muslims are engaged in the fight against Israel. The other elements of the axis of resistance have to take some sort of action. If they don't, then you have a real problem in coalition management, and the Persian Shia leadership of the axis of resistance is kind of exposed as just sending Sunni Muslims to their death for a cause.
Sir, I also wanted to get your opinion on the humanitarian aid, which is essential at the moment into Gaza. It's not making its way in. There were some figures which said that earlier there were 500 trucks which used to make it to Gaza. Then the current requirement is at least 100 trucks. 20 have been allowed, and finally 8 made it in a few days back. So it is a really tough situation. I wanted to take your opinion on this, that, will Israel slow down the bombardments to allow the humanitarian aid to enter? Is Israel only to blame for this, or are there other factors here?
Well, Israel will say that they have to be sure that humanitarian aid is not diverted to Hamas. And they'll point out that as a matter of fact, the Israeli military spokesman today pointed out that there was a substantial fuel storage areas in Gaza that were controlled by Hamas that were being used for military purposes rather than things like running hospitals. This is an inevitable problem when you have a siege. This is a siege, and supplies that go in, it's hard to determine where exactly they'll go. I don't have a whole lot of trust that Hamas will let humanitarian supplies go in. In the initial battles, the October 7th attack on Israeli settlements, some of the dead Hamas fighters were found with UN-issued first aid kits. So, there's already some evidence that these supplies are being diverted. I think Israel probably feels that there's greater diversion. But more to the point, it's just a very dangerous situation. And I'm not sure there's a lot of guys eager to drive large trucks into Gaza. There's significant risk involved. So this is difficult under the best of circumstances, and these are not the best of circumstances.
Definitely not the best of circumstances, and it is a problem which is inevitable. Thank you so much for joining in on the broadcast, sir. Always a pleasure to have you here on World DNA.
It's an honor.
Amid the raging war against Hamas, Israel is pulling out newer weapons from its arsenal. It has introduced 2 new weapons, Iron Sting and SpongeBob's, into its assault ahead of an expected ground offensive. Described as a game changer, Iron Sting is a guided mortar with unprecedented accuracy. It is expected to help Israel target specific enemy positions and minimize collateral damage as Hamas operates in a densely populated region. Moreover, the bombs are said to be cost-effective deterrent. And let's tell you the key features of Iron Sting. The weapon includes a mortar of 120 mm, and it is equipped with GPS facilities to hit targets with precision. The weapon uses laser guidance for pinpoint accuracy at a range of 1 to 12 kilometers. The aim of the new weapon is to transform ground warfare and provide battalions with accurate and effective firepower. Now let's move to the other ace in Arsenal Armory. This is the Sponge bomb that has been developed by Israeli Defense Forces to gain an edge in tunnel warfare. The bomb has become necessary to neutralize Hamas militants hiding beneath the ground in a dense network of tunnels. And the underground alleys stretching for kilometers serve as a safe shelter for Palestinian militants. It enables them to secretly move positions, smuggle weapons, execute surprise attacks and hide hostages. Hamas is believed to be hiding over 200 hostages in these tunnels at the moment, posing tactical and logistical challenges for Israeli forces. One of the unconventional features of the sponge bombs is that they do not contain explosives. Rather, they are designed to seal off tunnel gaps or entrances. And these weapons release a foam-like substance that rapidly expands and hardens. Sponge bombs have also been used earlier in 2021 in mock tunnel exercises. Now, whether these weapons will change the tide of Israel-Hamas war or not remains to be seen. But what cannot be denied is that the casualties are most certainly all set to go up further. A near end does not seem on the horizon for the ongoing Israel-Hamas war, and this as Israel says it is still preparing for its ground invasion into Gaza. While world leaders are discussing and negotiating over the conflict, a consensus does not appear to be workable so far. Meanwhile, the human suffering continues. And in the latest, Israel Defense Forces say that they have killed 3 Hamas militants who were struck by their fighter jets, and these militants played a significant role in the invasion and murderous attack against Israel on October 7th, as per the IDF. And they are considered to be the most significant brigade of the Hamas terrorist organization. The Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry claims more than 7,000 Palestinians have been killed so far in the war, and the ministry's toll includes more than 2,700 minors and at least 1,500 women. Hamas has also released the names of those who have been killed. On the other hand, Israeli jets continued flying over Gaza on Thursday after troops and tanks briefly raided the besieged enclave overnight. Now, speaking of the expected ground offensive, Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has said that it's not far off. He also added that Israel will carry out the operation when the conditions are right in order to strike Hamas. He also talked about tensions with Hezbollah on the border with Lebanon. He said Israel has no interest in expanding the war.
מלחמה בחזית הדרומית כנגד חמאס. אנחנו מוכנים לכל התפתחות בצפון. חיזבאללה סופג נפגעים רבים. יחד עם זה, אין לנו עניין להרחיב את המלחמה. היעד שלנו הוא ניצחון במלחמה והחזרתם של החטופים. התמרון יגיע ולא ירחק היום והוא יקרה. זה יקרה כאשר ייווצרו התנאים המתאימים על מנת להכות את ארגון החמאס, ולאחר שנשלים את משימתנו באש, כאשר הדבר הזה יקרה, אתם תראו אותו ותבינו את עוצמתו.
And while the defense minister said that Israel did conduct a military drill close to its border with Lebanon on Thursday, clashes with Iran-backed Hezbollah group have been frequent since the Israel-Hamas war broke out. More than 40 Hezbollah militants have been killed in the borderlands so far, while Israel's military says at least 7 of its soldiers have been killed. Meanwhile, devastation from war continues in Gaza, which can be seen in the new satellite images that show the north of the Gaza Strip before and after Israeli airstrikes on October 21st. Now, as Israeli airstrikes continue on Gaza, Libya's parliament has called for halting oil exports to those who back Israel. The parliament demands that Israeli aggression must stop, else the country must move forward with the decision. Hamas has meanwhile said at least 50 hostages held by the group have been killed so far. Group's armed wing says that these hostages have been killed in the continued Israeli strikes in Gaza. Speaking of hostages, a senior Qatari negotiator told in an interview that civilians being held hostages by Hamas in Gaza could be released within days. He said negotiations were very difficult, but progress was being made, and he cautioned that any escalation in the conflict could jeopardize those efforts. Diplomacy and negotiations around the war continue, and now a senior Hamas delegation has traveled to Moscow to meet Russian foreign ministry officials. Now, this is the organization's first high-profile international visit since its October 7 attacks on Israel. Iranian deputy foreign minister is in Moscow as well. And the 3 leaders held a trilateral meet as per a picture posted by Hamas. White House, while reacting to the meet in Moscow, has said that it's not time to support Hamas. EU leaders also meet in Brussels on Thursday to discuss the situation in West Asia. In a declaration agreed at a summit, the leaders expressed the gravest concern for the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza. They called for pauses in the fighting so that humanitarian aid could enter Gaza, and debate on the war also continue at the United Nations. The United Nations General Assembly held an emergency meeting on Thursday to discuss the dire situation. And after failed efforts at UNSC to adopt any resolution, representatives from Israel and Arab countries exchanged sharp accusations at the discussion in UNGA. Showing no signs of consensus, Iran's foreign minister, in a sharp remark at UN, warned that US will not be spared from the fire if war in Gaza continues. In other updates, Pentagon says that about 900 additional U.S. troops are heading to West Asia to protect U.S. personnel amid a surge in attacks by the region, amid a surge in attacks in the region by Iran-affiliated groups. As tensions soar over the Israel-Hamas war, U.S. troops have been attacked at least 12 times in Iraq and 4 times in Syria in the past week. Pentagon said that U.S. forces were targeted earlier on Thursday in Iraq as well, but the attack failed. At least 24 American military personnel have been wounded in these attacks. For more on this, our correspondent Susan Teherani gives us updates on U.S. troop deployments in West Asia. Take a look.
Pentagon officials are saying some 900 U.S. troops have been deployed to the Middle East region. These were troops that Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin talked about a few weeks ago. They were on prepare to deploy orders. However, it's not clear what part of the region they've been deployed to. Pentagon officials said on Thursday that they have not been deployed to Israel. Now, this deployment comes as the Hamas and Israel war rages on, but then the likelihood of this war spilling over to other parts of the region have now become very real as well.
A near end does not seem on the horizon for the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. This, as Israel says, it is still preparing for its ground invasion into Gaza. While world leaders are discussing and negotiating over the conflict, a consensus does not appear to be workable so far. Meanwhile, the human suffering continues, and in the latest, the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry claims more than 7,000 Palestinians have been killed so far in the war, and the ministry's toll includes more than 2,700 minors and at least 1,500 women. Hamas has also released the names of those who have been killed, and on the other hand, Israeli jets continued flying over Gaza and last on Thursday after troops and tanks briefly raided the besieged enclave overnight. Speaking of the expected ground offensive, Israel's defense minister Yoav Gallant has said that it's not far off. He also said that Israel will carry out the operation when the conditions are right in order to strike Hamas. He also talked about tensions with Hezbollah on the border with Lebanon, and he said that Israel has no interest in expanding the war.
מלחמה בחזית הדרומית כנגד חמאס. אנחנו מוכנים לכל התפתחות בצפון. חיזבאללה סופג נפגעים רבים. יחד עם זה, אין לנו עניין להרחיב את המלחמה. היעד שלנו הוא ניצחון במלחמה והחזרתם של החטופים. התמרון יגיע ולא ירחק היום והוא יקרה. זה יקרה כאשר ייווצרו התנאים המתאימים על מנת להכות את ארגון החמאס, ולאחר שנשלים את משימתנו באש, כאשר הדבר הזה יקרה, אתם תראו אותו ותבינו את עוצמתו.
And while the defense minister said that Israel did conduct a military drill close to its border with Lebanon on Thursday, clashes with Iran-backed Hezbollah group have been frequent since the Israel-Hamas war broke out, where more than 40 Hezbollah militants have been killed in the borderlands so far, while Israel's military says at least 7 of its soldiers have been killed. Meanwhile, devastation from war continues in Gaza, which can be seen in the new satellite images that show the north of the Gaza Strip before and after Israeli strikes on 21st October. Hamas has meanwhile said at least 50 hostages held by the group have been killed so far. Group's armed wings say that these hostages have been killed in the continued Israeli strikes in Gaza. Speaking of hostages, A senior Qatari negotiator told in an interview that civilians being held hostages by Hamas in Gaza could be released within days. He also said that negotiations were very difficult, but progress was being made, and he cautioned, however, that any escalation in the conflict could jeopardize those efforts. Diplomacy and negotiations around the war continue, and now a senior Hamas delegation has traveled to Moscow to meet Russian foreign ministry officials, and this is the organization's first high-profile international visit since its October 7 attacks on Israel. Iranian deputy foreign minister is in Moscow as well, and the three leaders held a trilateral meet as per a picture posted by Hamas. EU leaders also met in Brussels on Thursday to discuss the situation in West Asia. In a declaration agreed at a summit, the leaders expressed the gravest concern for the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza. They called for pauses in the fighting so that humanitarian aid could enter Gaza, and debate on the war also continue at the United Nations. The United Nations General Assembly held an emergency meeting on Thursday to discuss this dire situation. After failed efforts at UNSC to adopt any resolution, representatives from Israel and Arab countries exchanged sharp accusations at the discussion in UNGA, showing no signs of consensus. In other updates, Pentagon says that about 900 additional U.S. troops are heading to West Asia to protect U.S. personnel amid a surge in attacks in the region by Iran-affiliated groups. And as tensions soar over the Israel-Hamas war, U.S. troops have been attacked at least 12 times in Iraq and 4 times in Syria in the past week. Pentagon said that U.S. forces were targeted earlier on Thursday in Iraq as well, but the attack failed. At least 24 American military personnel have been wounded in these attacks.
For more than 18 days, Israel has relentlessly bombed the Gaza Strip. At least 7,000 Palestinians have been killed in the airstrikes so far.
Palestinian Health Ministry says that most of them are women and children. As the barrage of attacks by the IDF continues, there's another catastrophe unfolding on ground for those that are in the Strip. A health crisis is unfolding in Gaza as we speak.
As airstrikes continue, 1.4 million people in Gaza have fled their homes to seek temporary shelters. Now, doctors in Gaza say that several patients who are visiting the hospitals are exhibiting signs and symptoms of disease. The medical experts have pointed out to overcrowding and poor sanitation as the key factors triggering the spread of diseases here.
رعب وخوف. احنا يعني قاعدين زي ما بقولوا حاملين روحنا على كفنا. ولكن الوكالة بتقول انه هذا المكان آمن واقعدوا فيه. لكن بنضطر ان نخرج من هذا المكان. بنروح نشتري خبز، بنروح نعبي مية، بنروح نشتري بعض المستلزمات. في عنا اشياء كثيرة مش متوفرة ومش موفرها إلنا الوكالة. المأوى اللي متوفر لجزء من الناس وفي ناس قاعدين بدون مأوى.
For days now, international aid and humanitarian agencies have repeatedly issued warnings of an impending health crisis in Gaza. Over 1 million displaced Palestinians only have a few temporary shelters to seek refuge in. With spaces getting crowded and cramped up, civilians are now reporting of medical issues such as stomach and lung infections and rashes as well.
But this is where the problem worsens. For days, Israel did not allow for a humanitarian passage to Gaza. This after cutting off access to all essential supplies like food, water, medicines and electricity. When aid was finally allowed to be delivered to Gaza on the 21st of October, the quantity of supplies is merely a drop in the ocean. Gaza is only twice the size of Washington, D.C. After Israel's military action in the region, a substantial part of the Strip has been flattened. Acres are covered with debris.